welcome back from the break. I hope you're all re-energized. Yes, everyone's talking, so that's a good pointer for having a good break. Now, people, for the next 90 minutes, security threats towards the energy system are on the agenda. Considering climate change, natural hazards such as floods, wildfires, and blackouts are increasingly challenging the energy system. At the same time, more intentional threats require our attention, like cyberattacks, embedded electronics, and hybrid operations. In this session, we are going to discuss these different security threats and how to tackle them. And you are all invited to participate in that discussion. So, to give everyone, either you're a physical or a digital participant, an equal opportunity to ask questions, we are going to use the digital tool Slido. On the screen, and your name tag for those who are physically present, there is a QR code that you can scan, or you can open a browser, write Slido, slido.com, and you can enter the code ETC26. Quite logical. In the forum that you're entering, you can ask questions and promote the most relevant ones by clicking like. And I have two highly adept helpers reading through all the Slido activity and sending the most pressing and relevant input to me, and I'm going to try to convey as many questions as possible during the panel discussion towards the end of the session. Does that sound good? Yes, good, perfect. Let's start our round of presentations within the framework of energy security. Our first speaker is Dr. Emily Holland, the Eurasia Director at the Foreign Policy Research Institute, which is a non-partisan American think tank dedicated to foreign policy and national security research. Emily Holland, who is a political scientist, brings deep experience from NATO, the US Naval War College, and leading research institutions across Europe and the United States, all focused on how energy, security, and geopolitics intersect. She will open this session for us by zooming out to the big picture, the cross-border threats to our energy systems, in plural, and the vast infrastructure we rely on, from seabed to space. So, with no further ado, please welcome Dr. Emily Holland.
Thanks so much, everyone. I'm really thrilled to be here. It's a beautiful place, my first ever trip to Trondheim, and it's just as lovely as everybody said it would be. So the first panel did a really, really excellent job at kind of outlining the complex nature of threats, of energy security, and of competing policy priorities. And I will speak a little bit today about the spectrum of threats to energy systems that I saw when I was working at the US Department of Defense for 7 years, and then later when I was the political advisor for critical undersea infrastructure at NATO Maritime Command. So you may remember in Vilnius in 2023, there was a mandate to NATO to protect critical infrastructure. And of course, this came about after Nord Stream. So I went over to Maritime Command, which is in London in 2023, and we helped get this new operational center off the ground. So I'll talk a little bit broadly about threats, and then I'll zoom in a little bit to energy infrastructure in particular, because that's something that's really at the top of everybody's minds these days. So, of course, energy systems today are targets of war. We see this today in Ukraine with systemic attacks on power generation and distribution, deliberate attacks to degrade civilian infrastructure and resilience. And this is not new. So there's a Russian tactic called SODSIT, which is Strategic Operation for the Destruction of Critical Infrastructure, which is a military doctrine that far preceded the war in Ukraine, focused on targeting power systems and energy infrastructure. And its goal was not just military, but its goal was to disrupt society and undermine political will. Now, we don't just see this in Ukraine. We also see this in very recent events in Iran, right? In the Middle East, we see now legitimate targeting of civilian energy infrastructure as a military target. So beyond kinetic targeting, there are sort of several things that national security concerns that like the DoD and NATO focus on when it comes to energy security. So of course, there are disruptions to the global hydrocarbons markets. We see this today with the closure of the Strait of Hormuz and the disruptions to shipping, and of course, its effect on oil prices. infrastructure protection, which I'll talk about in a moment, and then secure but flexible supply chains. So the question of, is the energy transition trading one set of dependencies for another? There's also a huge focus on dual use synergies. So defense in particular is focused, because of the rise in autonomous vehicles and drones, on battery technology. So thinking through and doing R&D on increasing battery life with longer payload. So drones being able to go longer and carry more stuff. And what we see is there's sort of two prevailing approaches. There's the current United States approach to energy nationalism, which is really siloing away from any potential risks of Chinese dependence. And then there's the European approach, which views electrification as a means towards a strategic autonomy. But the two are not mutually exclusive, and they sort of both exist in both places. So what is critical infrastructure, and why is it so important? Well, it's huge, right? It goes from the seabed, and that's data cables, to pipelines. Then there's offshore things like platforms and wind farms. On land, there are grids, refineries, ports, and then in space, there is satellites. So it's a huge spectrum of different connected webs of infrastructure. And the threats are actually just as diverse. So there's cyber, sabotage, kinetic targeting, which I talked about in the initial incident, accidents, earthquakes, and climate events. Now, why is it so difficult to protect? There's sort of 5 main structural challenges. The first is scale. Well, it's vast, it's dispersed, it's very hard to monitor, and it's not just owned by one company or state. The second is asymmetry. So I'm not sure if any of you remember, in 2023, there was a ship called the Nunu Polar Bear, which dragged its anchor several hundred nautical miles across the seabed, and it damaged and actually cut, in some places, the Baltic Connector natural gas pipeline on the Gulf of Finland. Now, they claimed this was an accident. There are currently criminal investigations into this. The captain of that ship just pleaded not guilty. But this really shows about the difficulty of attribution. So it is very, very hard to say that this was not an accident. Can we prove this wasn't an accident? It's almost impossible to do so. But it shows that malign actors can do very, very low-cost things that have high-impact disruptions. It's so difficult to attribute, and it's also very costly to repair. So how expensive is it to drag an anchor across a seabed floor? It's basically nothing. But to repair that, you have to respond very quickly, and that causes huge disruptions to society. There's also coordination challenges. So who has a remit in CI? Well, the military, the civilian space, and the private sector. Every different country has different organizations responsible for protecting critical infrastructure. So in one state, who might be responsible for reacting to a call? Well, it might be the Coast Guard in one state. In another state, it might be the federal police. It might be the Navy. That's different in every state, and that's just on the military response side. You also have departments of transport, departments of economics, all different sorts, legal departments, all different sorts of government departments responsible for responding to these sorts of events. And that doesn't even take into account the private sector. So how do you organize all of these different actors? And in fact, there's actually very limited integration of these different actors together, so responding to these challenges is super hard. Right now, there's actually a lot of new reporting schemes that have just come out, which are fantastic, right? There's North Seal, which is a Belgian government reporting scheme. There's the NATO CUI Center. There's UK's Department of Energy Security and Net Zero. All these different schemes where an operator can report a problem to a government body. But that also is potentially fragmenting. Who are they supposed to report to? There are also legal regime issues, so there are different legal regimes that govern subsea cables versus pipelines. Did you know that? I didn't before I started that job. There are also very different insurance issues. So now that energy infrastructure is becoming a target by states, are those insurance schemes that cover infrastructure, do they protect against war? Oftentimes not. So there's all these different legal challenges that come up. There's also a strategic versus operational challenge. So there's great awareness of the challenge, but there's weaker execution and practical coordination. And so the key challenge is not just defending assets or even deterring against malign action. It's about managing a really complex, interconnected system under pressure and time constraints. Because when these things go out, you have to act very quickly to try to repair them. And sometimes you're delayed by things such as weather. So there's huge challenges that oversee this. And I got to wrap it up, but I'll just say really, really quickly, we've seen the threats and risks from a hydrocarbons-based system, and we're just sort of now trying to understand the risks and the vulnerabilities in a transition-based energy system. And it's very clear that the transition strengthens energy security, but only if resilience is built in from the start. And that's really the lesson that we're learning now, is building resilience into grids, building flexibility, all of these different things. And doing that can really make a much more resilient energy system moving forward. And I'll stop there. Thanks.